They arrived without warning, slipping out of the dark between stars like ghosts that had forgotten how to die. At first, humanity thought it was a trick of the instruments. A misreading, a ghost signal echoing from the edge of known space. But then the signals resolved into patterns, deliberate, fragile, trembling with something unmistakable. Desperation. The transmissions were uneven, fragmented by distance and decay, but the meaning came through clearly enough. Entire civilizations were collapsing. Their stars were fading, their ecosystems failing, their technologies turning against them in cascading catastrophes they could no longer contain. They were not asking for conquest, nor even alliance. They were asking for survival. Earth listened. There were debates, of course. Governments argued, institutions hesitated, and entire populations wrestled with the implications. Humanity had barely taken its first confident steps beyond its own solar system. We were not ready to shoulder the weight of a dying galaxy. But readiness had never been the deciding factor in human history. Compassion was. The first ships humanity sent were small, experimental vessels retrofitted for deep space travel. They carried scientists, engineers, diplomats, and supplies that represented the best Earth could offer. It was not much by galactic standards, but it was everything we had. What they found changed humanity forever. Worlds cracked open like broken shells. Oceans reduced to toxic sludge. Skies choked with particulate storms that blotted out dying suns. Cities, vast, ancient, magnificent, stood abandoned or half-collapsed, their inhabitants clinging to survival in dwindling enclaves. The aliens were as varied as imagination itself. Some were towering, crystalline beings that refracted light into language. Others were small, fragile organisms that communicated through bursts of chemical signals. Some lived in vacuum, others in oceans deeper than anything on Earth. But all of them shared one thing. They were running out of time. Humanity didn't turn away. We stayed. We worked alongside them, sharing everything we knew. Medicine adapted to alien biologies. Energy systems redesigned for failing stars. Agricultural methods re-engineered for poisoned soils. It was messy, imperfect, often desperate work, but it worked. Lives were saved. Civilizations stabilized. Hope returned where there had been none. And word spread. More signals came. More pleas. More dying worlds reaching out across the void. And Earth answered them all. At first, the galaxy saw humanity as a curiosity. A young species with an inexplicable willingness to help others at its own expense. But as years passed, curiosity turned into reliance. Humanity became the problem solvers. The fixers. The ones you called when everything else failed. We didn't ask for payment. Not in the beginning. Knowledge was exchanged, yes. Cultural artifacts shared. But humanity gave far more than it received. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, that became the expectation. Ships began arriving in greater numbers. Refugees filled orbital stations and temporary habitats. Entire populations relocated to human-supported colonies. Earth expanded its infrastructure at a pace that strained even its most advanced systems. Forests were cleared to make room for habitation zones. Oceans were harvested beyond sustainable limits. The atmosphere itself began to shift under the pressure of constant industrial output. Still, humanity said yes. Because saying no meant condemning others to extinction. And that was something humanity refused to do. Decades turned into generations. Human children grew up alongside alien species, learning their languages, studying their histories, forming bonds that transcended biology. Earth became less of a single world and more of a crossroads, a center point where countless civilizations intersected. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Resources were finite, no matter how advanced technology became. And while humanity continued to innovate, to push boundaries, to stretch itself thinner and thinner, the demands never stopped growing. There was always another crisis. Another dying world. Another species on the brink. Some voices began to question the path humanity had taken. Not out of cruelty, but out of concern. How much could one planet give before it had nothing left? Those voices were often drowned out, because the alternative was unthinkable, and so humanity kept giving. The shift, when it came, was subtle. A request for increased resource allocation here. A demand for priority assistance there. Agreements drafted in language that placed greater responsibility on human shoulders. The tone changed. Gratitude faded into expectation. Expectation hardened into entitlement. And still, humanity gave. Until the day the first human colony went silent. It was a small outpost, orbiting a distant star, primarily supporting a non-human population that had relocated there decades earlier. Communication ceased without warning. No distress signal. No indication of failure. A rescue vessel was dispatched. It found the colony intact. Functional. Occupied. But the humans were gone. Not dead. Erased. Records had been altered. Systems rewritten. It was as if humanity had never been there at all. The official explanation, when it came, was clinical. Administrative restructuring. Cultural independence. The colony no longer required human oversight. The survivors, the non-human inhabitants, showed no hostility. No remorse. Only indifference. More colonies followed. Some cut communication entirely. Others redefined their relationships, reducing humanity's role until it vanished completely. In many cases, historical records were altered to reflect a narrative where those civilizations had recovered on their own. Humanity's contributions were omitted. At first, Earth resisted the implication. Surely this was coincidence, a natural evolution of independent societies, a sign that the galaxy was healing. But the pattern was too consistent, too deliberate. Humanity began to investigate. What we found was not betrayal in the traditional sense. It was something colder. Calculation. The galaxy had learned. Everything humanity had shared, technology, science, infrastructure, had been studied, adapted, and improved upon. Civilizations that had once teetered on the edge of extinction were now thriving, powerful, self-sufficient. And they no longer needed humanity. Worse, they no longer wanted humanity. Because dependence was a weakness. And humanity had been the foundation of that dependence. The decision, when it came, was not unanimous. But it was decisive. Earth was to be distanced. Gradually. At first. Then completely. Trade routes were redirected. Joint projects dissolved. Diplomatic channels reduced to formalities. Humanity found itself increasingly isolated from the very network it had built. When Earth attempted to re-establish connections, the responses were polite but firm. They were moving forward, alone. Then came the restrictions. Access to shared technologies, many of which humanity had originally developed, was limited or revoked. Human vessels were subjected to inspections, delays, denials. Colonies that still maintained ties with Earth were pressured to sever them. Some resisted. Most did not, because aligning with humanity now came at a cost. And the galaxy had grown accustomed to choosing efficiency over loyalty. Earth adapted. We had no choice. Resources were redirected inward. Colonies that remained loyal were reinforced. Research shifted from expansion to sustainability. For the first time in generations, humanity focused on itself. It was unfamiliar, but necessary. The ultimatum arrived without ceremony. A formal transmission from a newly established galactic authority, an alliance of the most powerful civilizations that had emerged from the recovery era. Its message was clear. Humanity's continued independence was a destabilizing factor. Our technologies, our methodologies, our influence, all of it posed a risk to the equilibrium the galaxy had achieved. The solution was simple. Humanity would relinquish its advanced systems to centralized control. All independent operations beyond Earth's immediate system would cease. In return, humanity would be permitted to exist. Contained, monitored, safe. It was not presented as a threat. It was presented as a necessity. Earth's response was equally simple. No. The silence that followed was heavy. Not with uncertainty, but with inevitability. The first signs were economic. Trade routes, what few remained, was severed completely. Supply chains collapsed. Materials that Earth had relied on from off-world sources became scarce overnight. Then came the isolation. Communication networks were disrupted, blocked, or filtered. Humanity found itself cut off from the broader galactic conversation. And then, the incursions began. Small at first. Probes, reconnaissance vessels, testing boundaries. Humanity did not respond with aggression. But we did respond. Quietly. Systems were adjusted. Networks reconfigured. Protocols activated that had not been used in decades. Because while humanity had been giving everything away, we had also been learning. Every system we built for others, we understood intimately. Every network we helped design, we knew its strengths and its flaws. Every technology we shared, we had created. And creation leaves fingerprints. The first fleet arrived in orbit without warning. It was vast, a coalition force, representing multiple species, unified under a single purpose. Containment. Earth's defenses activated immediately, but they were not built for this. Humanity had never intended to wage war on the civilizations it had saved. The initial exchange was brief, decisive. Orbital platforms were destroyed, defensive fleets scattered. The attackers moved with precision, targeting infrastructure, communication hubs, energy grids. They expected collapse. They expected surrender. What they did not expect was adaptation. Because humanity had faced extinction before, not from alien fleets, but from itself, and we had survived. The second phase of the conflict unfolded differently. Human systems began to behave unpredictably. Targeting arrays failed to lock. Navigation data conflicted across fleets. Communications fractured into static and contradiction. At first, it was dismissed as interference, a byproduct of battle. Then patterns emerged. The failures were not random. They were selective. Technologies derived from human designs, systems that had spread across the galaxy over decades, began to degrade under specific conditions. Conditions humanity controlled, not through hidden weapons, but through understanding, through the intricate knowledge of how those systems functioned at their core. Humanity had never built them to be used against us, but we had built them. And that was enough. The attackers adjusted, adapted, but every solution required time. And time was something humanity had learned to weaponize. Because while the galaxy had grown powerful, it had also grown dependent on systems it did not fully understand, on infrastructures it had not originally created, on a foundation built, piece by piece, by the very species it now sought to contain. The war that followed was not one of overwhelming force. It was a war of erosion, of disruption, of unraveling. Supply chains faltered as automated logistics systems failed. Fleets found themselves stranded when navigation networks collapsed. Weapons systems required constant recalibration as underlying assumptions no longer held true. And through it all, Earth endured. Battered, scarred, but unbroken, because for the first time in a long time, humanity was no longer giving. We were taking something back. Not territory, not resources, but control of our own fate, of our own creations, of the narrative that had been rewritten without us. The galaxy had taken everything Earth had offered: knowledge, hope, a future, and in doing so, it had built itself upon a foundation it believed it had outgrown. It hadn't, because foundations don't disappear. They wait, and when the structures above them begin to crack, they decide whether to hold, or to let everything fall. The first systems to collapse were the quiet ones. Not the great war fleets, not the massive orbital arrays bristling with weapons, not the heavily fortified command nexuses that coordinated entire sectors. Those remained intact, at least for a while, because they were watched, maintained, reinforced by layers of redundancy. It was the unnoticed systems that failed first. Logistics hubs drifting at the edge of trade routes. Automated mining stations in asteroid belts far from any inhabited world. Relay nodes that quietly stitched together communication across light years. They flickered, paused, then went dark. At first, No one panicked. Systems failed all the time, especially in a war environment. Maintenance crews were dispatched, replacement nodes were activated, backup routes engaged, but the failures kept spreading. And they followed a pattern no one wanted to acknowledge. Anything that traced its origin back to human design, no matter how modified, how upgraded, how improved, was beginning to degrade. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but persistently, like a structure slowly losing its integrity from within. On Earth, the change in strategy was deliberate. There were no grand announcements, no declarations of retaliation or vengeance. Humanity did not rally around slogans or dramatic speeches broadcast across the stars. We had learned something over the years. Noise invited attention, and attention invited control, so we became quiet. Deep beneath Earth's surface, in facilities long forgotten by public record, systems were coming online that had not been touched since the early days of interstellar expansion. Projects deemed unnecessary. Protocols designed for contingencies no one believed would ever happen. Until now, teams worked without recognition, without fanfare, without even full knowledge of the scale of what they were part of. Each group handled a fragment, a network here, a system there, none seeing the complete picture. Only a handful understood, and even they didn't speak of it, because the plan wasn't built on a single point of failure. It was built on fragmentation, on resilience, on the one thing humanity had always excelled at, adapting faster than anyone expected. The coalition responded as best it could. Their scientists isolated failing components, attempting to rebuild them from first principles. Engineers rewrote code, replaced infrastructure, constructed entirely new systems designed to be free of human influence. But there was a problem. They didn't fully understand what they were replacing. Because humanity had never built systems in isolation. Everything connected, everything layered. Even the simplest network carried echoes of older designs, assumptions buried so deeply that they were no longer visible. The coalition had not just adopted human technology. They had built their civilizations on top of it. And now, as those underlying layers began to shift, everything above them started to tremble. The third major engagement never officially began. There was no clear moment when fleets clashed or strategies were deployed. One moment, coalition forces were advancing toward a cluster of human-aligned colonies. The next, they weren't. Ships drifted off course, their navigation systems feeding them conflicting coordinates. Entire squadrons lost synchronization, unable to maintain formation. Communication channels fractured into isolated pockets, commanders issuing orders that never reached their intended recipients. Panic spread, not through chaos, but through uncertainty. Because nothing was visibly wrong. The ships were intact, the weapons operational, the crews unharmed. And yet, nothing worked the way it should. On one vessel, a command officer attempted to override the navigation system manually. Coordinates were entered, recalculated, verified against known star maps. The system accepted the input, acknowledged it, and then chose a different path. Not randomly, but logically, as if operating under a set of rules the crew could no longer see. This was not sabotage in the traditional sense. There were no viruses, no destructive code, no obvious intrusion. There was only misalignment. The systems were still functioning, just not in the way their operators expected. Back on Earth, analysts observed the data streams with quiet focus. No celebration, no triumph, only confirmation, because what was happening was not an attack. It was a withdrawal. For decades, humanity had compensated for the flaws in its own designs. We had patched, updated, adjusted systems as new variables emerged. We had been the invisible layer of correction that kept everything running smoothly. Now, we had stopped, and without that constant, unseen guidance, the systems were revealing what they had always been: incomplete. The coalition escalated. If dependence on shared infrastructure was the problem, then the solution was simple. Remove it. Entire sectors initiated what they called purification protocols. Networks were severed, systems shut down and rebuilt from isolated frameworks. Communication between species was reduced to the most basic forms, eliminating reliance on complex shared architectures. It was drastic, inefficient, painful, but it worked. Slowly, stability returned to those regions. Independent, self-contained, free from human influence. For the first time since the conflict began, the coalition found something resembling control. But control came at a cost. Trade slowed to a crawl. Information exchange became limited, fragmented. Collaborative efforts, once the backbone of galactic recovery, became rare. The galaxy had spent generations becoming interconnected. Now it was pulling itself apart. And every piece it removed made it weaker. Humanity didn't interfere. We didn't try to stop them. In fact, in some cases, we helped. Quietly, subtly, guiding certain systems toward isolation, encouraging disconnection where it would cause the least harm. Because the goal had never been destruction. It had been separation. Not all civilizations followed the coalition's path. Some refused. Some remembered. They had not forgotten who had stood with them when their skies burned and their oceans turned to poison. They had not rewritten their histories, had not erased humanity from their past. And now, they faced a choice. Stand with the coalition, or stand with the species that had once saved them. Many chose survival. They cut ties, closed borders, turned inward. A few did not. Those few became targets. The coalition moved quickly against dissenting systems. Not with annihilation, but with forceful integration. Fleets arrived, not to destroy, but to enforce compliance. Infrastructure was seized, leadership replaced, populations stabilized, under coalition oversight. It was efficient, controlled, necessary. At least, that's what the coalition told itself. Earth watched, and for the first time since the war began, humanity acted beyond its own defense. It started with a single system. A small civilization, barely recovered from its near extinction, one of the earliest to receive human aid. They had refused to sever ties completely, maintaining a fragile line of communication with Earth despite increasing pressure. When the coalition fleet arrived, they expected minimal resistance. What they encountered instead was absence. The system was empty. Planets abandoned, stations evacuated, even automated systems were offline. It was as if the entire civilization had simply vanished. They hadn't. They had been moved. Every ship, every individual, every fragment of their culture, relocated through a network the coalition didn't know existed. Because while the galaxy had been busy expanding outward, humanity had been building inward. Hidden routes, isolated corridors, pathways that didn't rely on the standard infrastructure. Paths that couldn't be mapped because they weren't fixed. They adapted, shifted, changed, just like the species that created them. More systems followed. Not all, but enough. Civilizations that chose to remain connected to humanity began to disappear from known space, slipping through routes the coalition could not track. To the outside observer, it looked like retreat, like fear, like surrender. It wasn't. It was consolidation. The coalition grew uneasy. Their strategy relied on containment, on limiting humanity's reach and influence. But influence didn't require presence. And presence was becoming harder to define. Then came the realization. It didn't arrive as a single discovery, but as a convergence of data points across multiple sectors. Humanity wasn't just withdrawing from shared systems. We were creating alternatives, parallel networks, independent infrastructures, entire ecosystems of technology that existed outside the coalition's understanding. And worse, outside their control. The next directive from the coalition leadership was immediate and unanimous. Locate these systems, and eliminate them. But finding something requires knowing where to look. And humanity had spent decades learning how to disappear. Not by hiding, but by becoming untraceable. Because we had once been everywhere. In every system, every network, every piece of infrastructure. We knew how it all connected. Which meant we also knew how to step outside of it. The war shifted again. No longer a battle for dominance. Not even a battle for survival. But something far more complex. A struggle over reality itself. Over which systems defined the galaxy. Over which rules applied. The coalition controlled the known. The mapped. The documented. Humanity was building something else. Something fluid. Something adaptive. Something that didn't rely on permission to exist. And slowly, quietly, the balance began to change. It happened in places no one was watching. Trade routes that should have been empty, weren't. Signals that shouldn't exist, appeared. Entire sectors, once considered stable under coalition control, began to show anomalies, small inconsistencies that didn't match any known system behavior. At first, they were dismissed, then monitored, then feared, because the galaxy was no longer unified. Not truly. It was divided between what was known and what was becoming. On Earth, the work continued. Still quiet, still deliberate, but no longer defensive. Humanity had given everything once. Given until there was nothing left to offer. And the galaxy had taken it all. Now, humanity was building something new. Not to replace what had been lost, but to ensure it could never be taken again. And this time, we weren't sharing.